Hey everyone, Lori Spencer here. Welcome back to episode 11 of The Dark Side of RFK Jr. We have been reading this really interesting book by Jerry Oppenheimer called RFK Jr., Robert F. Kennedy Jr., and The Dark Side of the Dream. I hope you've been catching up on previous episodes, chapters you might have missed. Before we jump back into the book, there is some interesting news that I wanted to catch you up on. It's been a very eventful week on Capitol Hill, to say the least. As far as RFK Jr.'s confirmation process goes, he is now one step closer to becoming the nation's top health official after a February 6th vote in the full Senate. And I should probably explain this because the process is very complex. The Senate, leave it to the U.S. Senate to have a vote on whether or not they're going to vote on someone, but that's basically what happened this week. It went to the full Senate floor, and there's been some confusion. People thought he was confirmed as the HHS secretary. Not yet. This was just a vote where the Senate decided that they're going to vote on RFK Jr.'s confirmation. I know that's confusing, but it's a procedural thing, and it doesn't make any sense to me either. 52 senators, all of them Republicans, voted to advance Kennedy's nomination. Of course, he is seeking to lead the Department of Health and Human Services. 47 senators voted nay, all of them Democrats, and Senator Ted Cruz of Texas abstained, which is kind of interesting. Now, the Democrats, of course, including Chuck Schumer, Kirsten Gillibrand, voted along party lines, as you might expect, against his nomination, as did independent senators Bernie Sanders and Angus King, who tend to caucus with the Democratic Party. Senate Minority Leader Chuck Schumer said in a statement Wednesday, "Mr. Kennedy is a walking public health crisis waiting to happen. We need to look at Mr. Kennedy's record. He has spent years making millions peddling conspiracy theories and outright lies. His nomination should go no further," unquote. And I should point out, because it's just, it's worth mentioning, Chuck Schumer and Bobby Kennedy used to be very good friends back in the day, back when Bobby was still a good Democrat, which was not that long ago. He only left the Democratic Party about a year ago, I guess. And he's still not a Republican. As far as I know, Bobby still has not changed his voter registration. I think he's still a registered Democrat. Of course, we don't know how he voted last year, but I think we can assume he probably voted for at least President Trump. But this has been a painful process, I'm sure, for Bobby Kennedy going through these confirmation hearings, because he's known a lot of these senators very well on the Democratic side for many years. And they used to be very good friends. I mean, you can Google it. You can look. There are many pictures of Bobby with Chuck Schumer back in the day, and Hillary Clinton, and all of the New York elite Democrats that he used to run with. And now they oppose him vociferously. He's been friendly with Bernie Sanders. He was friendly with Liz Warren. And most of all, he was very close to Senator Sheldon Whitehouse, who this past week voted against him in the Finance Committee and grilled him pretty hard during his confirmation hearings. If you watch the previous couple of episodes, there's a lot of backstory about Bobby and Sheldon Whitehouse. They were practically best friends in college when Bobby was at UVA, and Sheldon Whitehouse was roommates with Bobby's brother Michael. Also, he attended Bobby and Emily's wedding there in Bloomington, Indiana, as we told the story in the previous episode, episode 10. So I'm sure for Bobby and for some of these Democratic senators, this process is very painful and very personal. So what happens next? This is where the procedural stuff gets a little bit confusing. The Senate Majority Leader, John Thune, filed a cloture motion this week, and that requires a 2/3 majority to end the debate or any filibuster and just take a vote on Kennedy. It looks like that is scheduled to come to the floor as soon as Monday, February the 10th. Democrats can't really stop that step from happening because it requires just a simple majority of 50 votes. According to the U.S. Senate website, the motion then lies over until the second calendar day on which the Senate is in session. So since Thune filed that motion on Kennedy's nomination Thursday, the vote on the motion should take place on Monday. Now, again, that's a reminder. It's just a vote on that motion for cloture. It's not a vote to confirm Kennedy as HHS secretary. I know that's confusing. So it'll be at least probably Wednesday before the Senate takes a vote on that. So let's get back into the book. Before we start, I'm just going to ask you to please like this video, share it with someone, share it with a friend, share it with your senator before they vote. Email your senator, make sure they see it, post it on their Twitter, and ask them to listen to this series. Grab that playlist link and make sure that your senator actually knows who Robert F. Kennedy Jr. is before they vote. And now, let's get back into the book. If you're reading along with me in the hardcover edition, we're jumping in on page 239. That's chapter 23, Barflop. New York, New York, it's a hell of a town, goes the song lyric. But life for Bobby Kennedy Jr. and Emily Ruth Black Kennedy in the big city didn't start out like that. Of the happy-go-lucky stars Gene Kelly and Ann Miller in that hit MGM musical On the Town, even though the newly minted groom rhapsodized that he and his bride felt that Manhattan was their kind of town. And Bobby had close ties there. The Big Apple of the Empire State was where his politically ambitious father had carpet-bagged his way in as U.S. Senator, his stepping stone, he believed, to the presidency. By the summer of 1982, the newlyweds had moved into the elegant quarters that Lem Billings had willed to Bobby. But he had to dip into his trust fund to purchase all of the memorabilia that adorned the place. Curiously, Billings had left none of those to the boy he loved in his will. The first major obstacle that Bobby faced was the bar exam that he was required to pass. He had been hired to work as an assistant district attorney in one of the nation's most prestigious prosecutor's offices, that of the Manhattan District Attorney. Not surprisingly, he had gotten the $20,000 a year post through powerful family connections. His boss was the legendary Manhattan DA Robert Morgenthau, who happened to be a boyhood friend of Bobby's uncle, the president. During Camelot, JFK had appointed Morgenthau to serve as the U.S. Attorney for the Southern District of New York. The day JFK was killed in Dallas, Morgenthau happened to be at Hickory Hill, having lunch with RFK, when FBI Director J. Edgar Hoover called with the assassination news. Thus, Bobby was as predestined to work for Morgenthau as he had been predestined to be admitted to Harvard, because of his family name and his platinum connections. Bobby wasn't the only famous namesake brought on by Morgenthau at the same time. The other was Cyrus Vance Jr., whose father was Secretary of State during the Carter administration. Bobby and Vance were among 55 assistant DAs hired in 1982. To avoid any hint of favoritism, the Democrat, Morgenthau, told reporters that Bobby and Vance were treated like everybody else when they were interviewed, and they will be treated like everyone else when they come here. With Morgenthau's encouragement, Bobby had chosen to specialize in criminal prosecution, but he wouldn't last very long in the job. Meanwhile, Emily was hired as a $21,000 a year public defender, working with the poor and indigent. As Bobby boasted at the time regarding their dual legal careers, he said, "She's interested in keeping people out of jail, and I'm interested in putting them in." Emily was one of more than 24 recently graduated lawyers who had joined the staff of the New York Legal Aid Society, and she and her hubby with the famous name were thought to be the city's first couple representing both sides in criminal matters. In some quarters, as the New York Times pointed out, They were compared to Katharine Hepburn and Spencer Tracy in the film Adam's Rib, about a husband and wife who played opposing lawyers in court, which never actually happened with the Kennedy couple. The opposition would happen much later when they had their divorce face-off. As a member of Morgenthau's staff, Bobby wasn't permitted to argue a case in court until he had actually passed the bar exam, a grueling test that many good lawyers fail. And just days before Bobby and Emily's first Christmas together as a married couple, he got the bad news. It had become public when the New York Law Journal published the list of those who had taken the exam in July and had passed. Only one Kennedy name was on it, Emily's. Bobby and Emily had been among 5,000 or so who had taken the 12-hour test, and 4,028 of them had passed. That's 69.2%. Of the new assistant DAs in Morgenthau's office, Bobby was among 6 of them who had failed the bar exam. When word of Bobby's failure reached the press, he and Morgenthau refused to comment. Bobby was eligible to take the exam again in February of 1983. Until then, and until he passed, he essentially was being carried along by Morgenthau. Bobby's failure received little, if any, press attention, unlike the media circus that occurred regarding his cousin, John Kennedy Jr., some 8 years later, when he flunked the bar exam not once, but twice in 7 months. Each time he failed, he faced blaring tabloid headlines, "The Hunk Flunks." In that period, when Bobby learned that he had failed the bar exam, there was much bad karma for him and Emily. On a chilly night just before Thanksgiving 1982, Emily was walking home at 11 p.m. to 5 East 88th Street, across from Central Park, when 3 teenagers accosted her on the corner and grabbed her pocketbook. According to initial reports, a passing cab driver saw the purse snatch, nabbed the 3 boys, who were in their mid-teens, recovered the purse, which had $120 cash in it. She had just left a Citibank ATM, and held them until New York's finest arrived. But the cops were shocked when Emily indicated she didn't want to press charges. They reportedly pleaded with her, but she was adamant. At the local precinct, the cops took the boys' names and addresses and let them go. Because she was a Kennedy wife, the purse snatch, a common crime in the city that never sleeps, received a lot of press. The Daily News headline blared, "3 mugged a Kennedy and went free." The New York Times announced, "3 snatched the purse of Emily Kennedy on Upper East Side." The New York Post trumpeted, "Kennedy wife lets muggers go free." One report had it that Bobby tried to convince her to do the right thing and pursue this case, but she was adamant, just as she had been when she nixed St. Patrick's in favor of First Christian. Another news account said that 2 hours after the incident, Bobby had convinced Emily to call the police precinct and tell them what happened, but she was still against pressing charges. As a legal aid attorney, her philosophy was to not send people to jail. She and Bobby had been invited to the annual Kennedy Clan Thanksgiving gathering at the family compound in Hyannisport, but they didn't go because Bobby supposedly had come down with an intestinal bug. When home, he convinced her to, as one headline soon blared, charge teen thugs. She also revealed that she had actually chased and caught one of the young hoodlums, and that the cabbie and several others had grabbed his 2 henchmen, one of whom had a prior arrest for street robbery. She denied, saying that she wouldn't press charges. When they were taken to the police station, they seemed really scared, she told a reporter. "I was in a hurry to get home to my husband, and I told police that I would let them know about pressing charges. I was so relieved that I had my money. I told Bob, and in the conversation I said I was thinking about not pressing charges, and he said that I should. After I calmed down, I said that I believe these things have to be prosecuted. Even though they don't seem like criminals, a person does have to press charges. It was the night before Thanksgiving, so the whole idea was to let the parents have their children for the holiday while the decision about charges was being made. Bobby had been playing the rebel since his teen years and had begun to portray himself as a radical of sorts in his 20s when it came to environmental issues, underscored by the tiff he got into on the eve of his wedding with a nuclear energy advocate and LaRoucheite. He and Emily had later even attended an anti-nuclear rally in Hollywood. But it was actually Emily, never considered radical or rebellious, who hit the pavement on a picket line. That October of 1982, she joined more than 500 of her fellow legal aid lawyers in a citywide strike that virtually crippled New York's court system, all of it mainly over the firing of one of the lawyers and the expiration the previous July of a union contract. The Times, in a commentary, called the strike calamitous for thousands of defendants and asserted that constitutional rights were eroding every day the strike continued. The old gray lady demanded a quick settlement, and the city's mayor, Ed Koch, denounced the strike, calling it unethical. Thus, the Kennedy couple's first married year in New York had been a difficult one, and along with everything else, Bobby's bar exam failure, Emily's mugging, and the strike, his beloved setter, Hogan, had gotten lost in the mean streets of Manhattan when a friend of the couple's took him for a walk but forgot to put him on a leash. The Kennedys pleaded with the public to call the ASPCA if they spotted him. There was one good piece of news, though. Before the strike started, Emily had won her first case, getting an acquittal for a 20-year-old Brooklyn man who had been arrested for selling $5 worth of marijuana to a narc. She was said to have convinced the jury that it was a case of mistaken identity. But life for Bobby would only get worse, despite his wonderful bride, his prestigious new job, and the couple's plans to have children. In New York, with his much publicized job, his failure to pass the bar, and increased media scrutiny, he felt intense pressure to prove himself. After all, he was the self-styled leader of his Kennedy generation. As he said around the time of his wedding, "If you want to compete with the best people, you go to New York. You can't bring out the best in yourself unless you do that." But the city offered temptations that he had difficulty resisting, most of them involving the availability of hard drugs. He often was invited to get high by Kennedy acolytes and hangers-on in the social scene, where heroin had become chic and plentiful. From years back, he knew where to score: Harlem. It was now just 3 miles north of where he and Emily were living in high style. Just as he had befriended the radical blacks when he was at Pomfret School, before he was asked to leave because of his drug use and bad behavior, he was said to have developed similar relationships in New York's ghetto in order to score. He sometimes visited a boarded-up slum building that was a shooting gallery, where he was the only white guy, let alone the only scion of a world-famous family. At Morgenthau's office, colleagues suspected he came to work high at times and seemed incoherent. Every so often he requested some time off, staying with loyalists who were tasked with helping him get clean, the Bobby sitters. But it rarely worked out. "He was so fucked up," said one source who asked to be anonymous. "It was tragic. We feared it had to end badly." His wife was at a loss as to what to do or how to help him, and with no one to whom to turn. Emily was going through hell, a close associate said years later, looking back to that horrific time. She felt isolated. Even when they were together at UVA Law, she knew that Bobby had this problem, but she was in love and naively thought it was a phase or something he could handle. He couldn't, and she was devastated. According to Kennedy family biographers Peter Collier and David Horowitz, all the time he was working as an assistant district attorney, He was making the forays he'd always made into Harlem. In an effort to disguise his identity, they said, he wore a Navy watch cap pulled down low, looking like some street person. Luckily, narcotics cops staking out the area didn't arrest him. A close Harvard friend of Bobby's, 27-year-old Eric Brindell, wasn't so lucky. The recently hired Senate Intelligence Committee staff aide was arrested in mid-May of 1983 when he and a friend, a 32-year-old former Justice Department lawyer, Winston Prude, described in a Spy magazine account of the arrest as a fellow Kennedy hanger-on, tried to score 5 bags of heroin for $150 from undercover narcotics officers at a Holiday Inn in a black section near the U.S. Capitol in Washington. Both had been on Bobby and Emily's wedding guest list a year earlier. Eric Brindell had recently received a top security clearance to work in the office of Senator Daniel Patrick Moynihan of New York, who had been an Assistant Secretary of Labor for Policy during JFK's administration. Like Bobby, Brindell had graduated from Harvard, magna cum laude, and had been editorial chairman of the Harvard Crimson. He had also done work, like Bobby, at the London School of Economics. At the time of Eric Brindell's death at age 42 in 1998, officially from Hodgkin's disease, but rumored to have been AIDS related to dirty needles, he was a senior vice president of Rupert Murdoch's News Corporation and an influential neoconservative. Bobby was among those who mourned at his funeral. Prude had once gone on one of Bobby's exotic South American expeditions and had brought a supply of recreational drugs that had gotten rain-soaked, but he was said to have lapped the mix up as if it were a soggy stew and had then become very ill. Some years later, he also died of a heroin overdose. When Eric Brindell was arrested, Bobby feared that his own name might surface during the investigation, and reportedly it did. He then tried again to kick his own drug habit, but was unsuccessful. Moreover, his behavior had become odd. The Coast Guard spotted him adrift in a 16-foot Boston whaler off Hyannis without proper registration papers, a life jacket, or distress signals. When the authorities contacted his mother, she acknowledged that the boat belonged to Bobby's brother Douglas, and Ethel Kennedy reluctantly admitted that she had never bothered to get the boat registered. As a result, Bobby was written a ticket. With the scare triggered by Eric Brindell's arrest, Bobby took a leave from his ADA job, and he and Emily traveled to Deadwood, South Dakota, to spend time with his ex-priest friend Bill Walsh to try to get clean of drugs. Bill Walsh later told a reporter for People magazine, "Late at night, he'd come down and we'd have a few beers at the bar and throw darts." Back in New York, Bobby again took the bar exam, and then he and Emily took off for a vacation in Jamaica. Bobby didn't fare as well as Emily after he passed the bar and tried his first case as prosecutor in the People of the State of New York versus Leonard Walker, charged in the assault of a Garment District co-worker. Bobby's courtroom adversary in the 3-day criminal court trial was actually a colleague of Emily's, another Legal Aid Society defense lawyer, David Stern, also in his first trial. Bobby lost. The judge, Jack Rosenberg, offered a defeated-looking Bobby a ride home and gave him a piece of advice. I told him not to let it disturb him. Collier and Horowitz had noted that after Lem Billings's death, Bobby had lost the emotional support that had helped him maintain that underpinning of fantasy which had been his hope and his strength. Now it was rumored in Morgenthau's office that he was nodding out in court and that his cases were suffering. In conversations about the future of their fabled clan, Bobby's drug-addicted brother David had once said, "America needs a rest from the Kennedys, and vice versa." Bobby called it junkie talk, and David responded, "You're a junkie too. You just haven't admitted it yet. Chapter 24, Shooting Up. The last places at which 29-year-old Bobby Kennedy Jr. needed to be partying were the Manhattan night spots Rockabout and JP's, both known for a wild scene, strong drinks, and gourmet drugs. One night in early September 1983, Bobby was at Rockabout, a frenetic punk chic hangout, to celebrate his cousin William Willie Kennedy Smith's 23rd birthday. Bobby was close to Smith, who would have his own serious headline-making troubles in the 1990s. He would be charged with rape in Palm Beach while bar hopping with his Uncle Ted, but later acquitted in a circus-like trial. Smith was the son of Jean Kennedy Smith, who had introduced her college classmate, Ethel Skakel, to RFK. The next night, Bobby was at JP's for a bachelor party for the video production company executive Peter McKelvey, who was soon to marry Christopher Kennedy Lawford's 27-year-old sister, Sydney, one of the 4 children of Bobby's alcoholic aunt, Patricia Kennedy Lawford. But when the wedding was held, later in September at the Kennedy compound, Bobby wouldn't be there. By then, his drug addiction had finally caught up with him and had become public. JP's nightclub was reputed to always have a supply of cocaine available for VIP friends and customers, such as Saturday Night Live's John Belushi, a regular who would die just a few months later of an overdose. Downstairs at JP's was what was described as a secret room where a fair amount of cocaine was ingested. The night Bobby was at JP's, he had been drinking heavily and then started getting high. He appeared over the edge. The reason he couldn't attend his cousin Sydney Lawford's wedding not long after was because on the evening of September 11th, 1983, a few days after his Manhattan partying binge, Bobby Kennedy Jr. had hit bottom. 14 years later, in his book The River Keepers, Bobby, in a few rare and candid autobiographical paragraphs, asserted that the biggest battle in his life was with addiction to drugs. He claimed, "I was functional while using and able to put down drugs for long periods of time, months and even years, but I always went back." In his tight circle of loyal friends, he had become known as a binger who had the ability to go on and off drugs. It could be cocaine, then alcohol, prescription pills, or heroin. His drug history went way back to his teen boarding school days after his father's death, and he was always too embarrassed or too ashamed to seek professional help, fearful that if he did, he would be publicly humiliated and revealed as an addict, scandalizing his family even more and blacken his father's name. Still, he boasted in his book that he possessed, quote, "strong willpower in every other area of my life, but that it had, quote, fueled my denial." Incredibly, he also threw blame on what he called an aggressive and nosy press for keeping him from attending his 12-step programs, where, quote, "I might have otherwise found recovery." Because of the many Kennedy scandals through the decades, Bobby had come to resent the press, the messenger, rather than question his own family's faults that sparked those scandals. His view of the press was that it was sick, as he once declared. "They don't explain important issues. They appeal to the prurient interests at the reptilian core of our brains, the craving for sex and celebrity gossip," he often said in his speeches in the 2000s. "So they give us Lacey Peterson and Kobe Bryant and Michael Jackson, Brad and Angelina, Tom and Katie. We're the best entertained and the least informed people on earth." Many people close to the Kennedys believed that the cause of Bobby's drug addiction, beginning when he was around 14 years old, was the violent death of his father, that getting lost in drugs was Bobby's way to cope, that drugs were a tourniquet for the perceived emotional wound caused by Sirhan's fatal bullets. But it wasn't so, at least not in Bobby's perception. For his addiction, he mainly blamed the youth revolution of the late 60s that paralleled his father's death. He believed his habit was possibly a political statement, and he believed his addiction might have been in his DNA, inherited from the Kennedy clan and the Skakel dynasty. I was part of a generational revolution that looked at drugs almost as a political statement, he said years later. He called it a rebellion against the preceding generation, which had opposed the civil rights movement and promoted Vietnam. At that time, I don't think any of us were aware of how damaging drugs could be. He expressed that view to Oprah Winfrey in 2007 when he agreed to be interviewed by her, and she actually did a decent job of interrogating him. In pressing him on why he became a drug user, she said that she thought every addiction is a cover for an emotional wound. But Bobby said he couldn't agree with that assumption. He said, "I don't know whether addiction is principally genetic, a result of emotional injury, or a combination of both," he said. "But all that matters is what I do today." Insight doesn't cure the addict any more than insight cures diabetes, he continued. You might understand perfectly well how diabetes works, but if you don't take your insulin, you're dead. The same is true with addiction. It doesn't matter what got you there. It's how you conduct yourself today, day to day. When Bobby was a kid, he claimed that he always had iron willpower to control his appetites. And even at the age of 9, he gave up candy for Lent, and he maintained that he didn't take a bit of chocolate or any other sweets until much later when he got into Harvard. If so, he was one of the rare tokers who never got the munchies because he was smoking pot long before he got into college. In his chat with Oprah, he maintained he had earnestly tried to stop using drugs, but "I couldn't," he said, which he felt was the most demoralizing part of addiction. "I couldn't keep contracts with myself." While it was later revealed that he also had a sex addiction, he told Oprah, quote, "I've been sober for 23 years, and I'm one of the lucky ones. I've never had a single urge for drugs since. Once I completed a 12-step program, the obsession I lived with for 14 years just lifted. I would describe it as miraculous." One thing that helped, he asserted, was his religion. Quote, "I say the rosary every day." He kept the prayer beads in his pocket. When he was a child growing up in Hickory Hill, he professed to have accepted a very religious moral code, one that he maintained, quote, "forbade dishonesty and illegal activities in general," he wrote in The River Keepers. But his use of drugs had caused him, quote, "to devote less energy to pursuing the principles that he'd been taught. The addiction," he wrote, "increasingly challenged my capacity to live up to my values and the dictates of my conscience." Again, there was no mention of his sex addiction, also revealed in his own words in his personal diary, which he never thought would become public. While The River Keepers has some 300 pages, mostly about his environmental work, Bobby wrote off in just several dozen words what happened on Republic Airlines Flight 967, en route on a Sunday evening from Minneapolis to Rapid City, South Dakota, where he hoped, once again, to quietly get help for his serious drug addiction. Just 17 months after he had taken the vows of holy matrimony, Bobby had suffered a conceivably fatal overdose, high on heroin at 20,000 feet. One of the other 45 passengers aboard the Convair turboprop had been dozing off when he heard a cry for help coming from the toilet. He looked over, saw the door ajar, and that someone in there desperately needed assistance. Pasty-faced, sweating, eyes rolling around, seated precariously on the toilet, boots off, icy feet clad in white socks, speaking incoherently, the unidentified young man was clearly very, very ill. It had taken a good 5 minutes to convince him, attired in scruffy jeans and a work shirt, to leave the restroom and lie down in the closest passenger seats. One of the passengers, later identified as William Wakerly, a school administrator, had first heard the young man's cries, and later he told People magazine for a cover story headlined "Two Worlds of a Kennedy" that the man was, quote, white as a sheet, cold as an ice cube. There was a loss of muscle control. The eyes were wide open and fully dilated. His pulse was weak. I couldn't get it from his wrist, so I took it from his neck. It was 30 and weak, which concerned me. By the time the plane landed in Rapid City, an ambulance and 2 police cars were waiting on the tarmac. Paramedics checked his blood pressure and pulse, which had normalized, and Bobby was permitted to leave the plane on his own power. Miraculously, he had defied something more serious. At one point, one of the stewardesses had asked Wakerly to get some identification from the young man. Bobby lied. He told me his name was Bobby Francis, Wakerly later recalled, and he spelled it out for me. Under police questioning in the airport, however, Bobby was forced to give his true identity, and jaws literally dropped. Detained for several hours, he spent some of the time idly reading a history book that he had with him, acting as if nothing out of the ordinary had occurred. Some people had been waiting at the airport for his arrival, and when they learned what had happened, telephone calls were made. Before long, a Rapid City lawyer, a one-time Bostonian by the name of John Fitzgerald, arrived at the airport to confer with Bobby. His luggage was confiscated and held by the police while they sought a search warrant, and that would take a couple of days to be issued. Meanwhile, Bobby was released and went off with a pretty young woman driving a classic Ford Thunderbird. He was said to have spent the night at the Deadwood home of Bill Walsh, who acknowledged that Bobby was on his way to South Dakota to get help for his addiction. Back in New York, Emily Black Kennedy was devastated when she heard what had happened. Even before their marriage, she had tried to help Bobby kick his addiction. She had kept his problem as private as possible. Now, his arrest had made the front pages of newspapers around the country. On a number of levels, said a close friend years later, Emily didn't want Bobby's drug addiction to be public. A lot of press people followed her around, and she tried to keep a low profile as much as she could. She persevered. She was always a quiet person, but she just withdrew even a little bit more. Several days after his overdose, Bobby was admitted to a Summit, New Jersey hospital that had been known for drug and alcohol rehab and psychiatric treatment since the early years of the 20th century. In the 1980s, it was one of the places for celebrities with addiction problems to dry out. Assisting him with travel and admissions was the drug counselor, Don Jewell, who had been on the guest list at Bobby's wedding, and who had tried to treat David Kennedy's drug addiction as well, unsuccessfully. From his Uncle Ted's Senate office, a brief statement for the press and the public was released in Bobby's name. It said, quote, "I have admitted myself to the hospital for the treatment of a drug problem. With the best medical help I can find, I am determined to beat this problem. I deeply regret the pain which this situation will bring to my family and to so many Americans who admire my parents and the Kennedy family. I am grateful for the support of my wife, Emily, the other members of my family, and my friends during this very difficult time." Years later, in a short paragraph in the Riverkeepers, he mentioned his arrest and noted that it had, quote, generated tremendous publicity and, ironically, neutralized my fear of scandal, allowing me to get help. During his stay in rehab, there were a number of medical issues that had to be addressed, according to a confidant. he was given medication that helped to reestablish whatever his body required. At one point, he had to take interferon, a harsh drug, but that was medically necessary. Interferon was often used to treat hepatitis C virus caused by intravenous drug use. Bobby remained hospitalized for some 5 months, early into 1984. It was the kind of financially astronomical stay that only a family as wealthy as the Kennedys could afford. Others of far lesser means, who were caught using and possessing heroin more often than not, wound up in junkie hellholes like Rikers Island, or eventually were found dead because no treatment was available. 5 days after he was discovered high in the plane's restroom, he was charged with possession of a small amount of heroin, 183 milligrams, about a fifth of a gram, that was found in his carry-on bag, according to the state's attorney in Rapid City. Because Bobby was already in treatment in the Garden State and his lawyer had pledged that he would attend any court appearances, he was granted a personal recognizance bond. In South Dakota, even the smallest amount of heroin in a person's possession was then considered a felony. In Bobby's case, it was punishable by a prison sentence of as long as 2 years and a fine of $2,000. In mid-March 1984, 2 months after turning 30, Bobby was out of rehab and had begun his 2 years of court-enforced probation. He had been ordered by Judge Marshall F. Young of the 7th Circuit in Rapid City to undergo drug testing, to continue treatment, to become a member of Narcotics Anonymous, and to start 1,500 hours of community service, all the while remaining in New York. A violation meant 2 years in prison. Because of his drug issues, he had left the DA's office after just a year. Emily Ruth Black Kennedy was a saint, observed a person who knew her well, because she took Bobby back after all the hell he put her through. People who knew her, like me, thought she was crazy because we didn't believe he could change. You know, once a junkie, always a junkie, even if the drug was something else, like alcohol or sex. But Emily hung in there. Moreover, by the time he was on probation, he had gotten her pregnant. And on September 2nd, 1984, she delivered a 7-pound, 11-ounce boy named Robert Bobby Francis Kennedy III, after his recovering drug addict father and his fabled slain presidential candidate grandfather. In April 1988, 10 days after Bobby and Emily's 6th wedding anniversary, she gave birth to their second child, Kathleen, also known as Kick, Alexandra Kennedy. Her first name was in honor of both Bobby's sister Kathleen Kennedy Townsend and the aunt that Bobby never knew, Kathleen Kick Agnes Kennedy, his father's sister, who was killed in a 1948 plane crash. The middle name, Alexandra, was in honor of Bobby's mother's niece from her Skakel side, who had been born severely handicapped in 1952, a birth that reminded the Skakels and the Kennedys of the retarded Kennedy sister Rosemary, born to Bobby's grandmother, Rose. Neither of Bobby and Emily's children would follow in the Kennedy family traditions of politics and public service. RFK III saw himself as a filmmaker when he grew up, and Kick would be an actress. Chapter 25, Community Service. Since Bobby Kennedy Jr. was required to perform hundreds of hours of community service and stay within the confines of New York State as part of the sentence on his heroin possession charge, he found a volunteer job in January 1984, the same month that he turned 30, with an environmental organization that was involved in cleaning up the polluted Hudson River. The internship launched his career as an outspoken environmentalist and environmental lawyer, eventually considered the most powerful in the country, all woven into the turbulent fabric of his Kennedy world. Just 3 months after he began that new chapter of his life, there was yet more tragedy in his family involving the futility and horror of drug addiction. On April 24th, 1984, during the Easter holidays, After a week of heavy drinking and cocaine use, a marathon bender, his brother, David Anthony Kennedy, died of an overdose. His death came a few months before his 29th birthday, and just a few days after getting out of a month of yet another try at kicking his addiction through rehab. "It was hideous," said Bobby years later, asserting he was my best friend. Ethel Kennedy learned of her son's tragic end when she called the Brazilian Court Hotel in Palm Beach, where David was staying in a $292 a night suite. Across the hall, his brother Douglas, then 17, was installed with a prep school friend, and the three had shared meals in the hotel dining room. Many of the Kennedys were at the family's fabled oceanfront Palm Beach mansion, gathered to celebrate the holiday and to visit with the 94-year-old ailing matriarch, Rose Kennedy. But troubled David had walled himself off from his family, and they from him, embarrassed by his behavior and drug issues. His mother had called the hotel to see whether he had left yet to catch a flight to Boston. When the room clerk got no answer on the house phone, she went to his room and found him dead. "I had an ominous feeling," Ethel Kennedy said later. David was her fourth born, her third son after Joe and then Bobby, and he had died from using too much high-grade cocaine along with the painkiller Demerol and the tranquilizer Mellaril. His body was shipped to Hickory Hill, where family members and all of his siblings and friends had gathered for an old-fashioned Kennedy-style wake, an event at which the clan was expert. The tale of another scandalous Kennedy tragedy had made news around the world. The New York Times, in a lengthy story headlined, "A Troubled Kennedy Makes His Last Trip Home," observed that since his father's death, his anguished life had been dominated by drugs, alcohol, and the seeming inability to handle the pressure of being a member of the most closely watched family in America. After David died, a young woman named Mary Richardson, who later would become Bobby's second wife, telephoned her friend Andy Warhol and told him that the only thing David had on the wall of his apartment was the napkin drawing I gave him, wrote Warhol in his diary. "I don't remember if I drew a cock or just hearts." Curiously, Andy Warhol noted that David was the RFK son that everyone thought might be gay. "Blonde and pretty and fey," he wrote, "and not like a dog. He didn't have those Kennedy teeth." David Kennedy was buried next to his grandfather, the Kennedy clan patriarch, Joseph P. Kennedy, in the family plot in Holyhood Cemetery in Brookline, Massachusetts. He was the first of Ethel Kennedy's brood to predecease her, and the first, but not the last, of his generation, Bobby's generation, to die tragically. After the funeral, and many years later, a friend recalled Bobby telling him, as he watched his brother's casket being lowered into the ground, "There, but for the grace of God, go I. That could have been me." And I think I will stop there. That was a very powerful chapter, and obviously a dark chapter in Bobby Kennedy Jr.'s life. And we will talk about in the next episode sobriety and yet that other addiction. Once he kicked the drug addiction, there was that other addiction that it sounds like to this day, Bobby has still not conquered. And we'll tell you what that is and talk more about it in the next episode of The Dark Side of RFK Jr. So be sure to join us. Please subscribe to the channel. Be sure to click that notifications bell so you'll always know when new episodes are uploaded. Until next time, take care of yourself. I'll see you soon. I'm Lori Spencer. Thanks for listening.